because I got an email from you. So I'm going to publicly show it.
I might not be the one to explain it fast enough.
So, Tom, why do you send me this picture? Why are you sending me this picture?
Last year you did the 4 fingers for the way of Christ and the apostles, and so we were doing that and sent it to you. Yeah, you haven't done it this year yet.
We did it in, I should pull up, we got a whole bunch of Indians that are doing that at the celebration, too. It's fun. We've got some people in our church group that absolutely despise it, and we got people in our own churches that love it. I've heard from both.
That's a sign. That's a sign you've been bit and you're functioning like a zombie.
And my only thought is the more mature you get, the wider your Romans 14 is. So that's how.
Hey, David dear, would you run out there and chase whoever is out there in? Because it's not Africa time nor India time.
It's Ames Morning City Church time.
Indian time is he's just left, which means he hasn't even left it, or he's just come. He's just come. That means he hasn't left his home yet.
Which means it still could be 2 hours.
Am I right?
If you're in Bangalore, that's true anyway. Okay, what a great lunch. Could you tell that meat had been smoked for 18 hours? That was some good meat. My goodness. World class. So this afternoon, session 4, Paul's process of doing theology and culture within the grand strategy, Jeff. Are we making progress? Feel like this morning made a little bit more better sense than yesterday's? We moved the needle? Felix?
Hopefully it's moving from, Michael and I had this conversation before because we both felt the same about the first 2 sessions, that you're a lot more abstract in the first 2. It's biblically based, but abstract. It should be getting more concrete and to the point that you can see these things not only are important in creating the benchmarks, full color benchmarks, but the usableness of it should be getting clearer to you.
Yep. I hope to be able to actually have you go through the assessment guide and do just some simple assessment and share that here. Let's see how this afternoon goes. But, all right, Jeff. Is there any lingering questions out there or comments that people feel compelled to? All right, we'll get back to you on schema, Cruz. How's that sound? Cruz is our up-and-coming third-gen guy, active in his learning, and is not afraid to be zealous and passionate. So you want to keep your third-gen, their zealousness and their passion, because that can turn into a contender, which is what Jude and the Petrine Circle are all about, contending for the faith. So good question, Cruz, but we won't tackle that at the moment. All right. Anything else? Anything else that's lingering out here? No? Okay, so as we're going through this, we'll just write down one thing you're learning. Write down 2 things you're learning as we're going through this. So, Jeff, what do we need to do to frame in the 4th one? Doing theology in our cultures, which are all unique, right? Within the grand strategy.
Yeah.
What in the world are we talking about?
You know,
what do we need
that's right. It's
because there's 1,000 cultures out there.
all the way back to our original circle of building a foundation from Scripture, dealing with issues, doing theology and culture, theology in a network, theology in civilizations, is hard for people to understand. You know, what do you do theology and culture? Someday we're going to have to probably get away from that phrase. But this will hopefully make that idea concrete. Guess that's not very profound. But
Okay, that was great. What do we mean by...
I'm still being driven nuts. Somebody find the African table. I want them to hear this.
I don't know where Josaphat is and Joseph, and
I got the same disease you do.
you want everybody to be highly, highly engaged. So, theology and culture, I think let's just do some basic explanation there, Jeff, before you hop up and do this session. So, let's just explain the title. Theology and culture, you're attaching yourself to the traditioning processes. You're attaching yourself to the scripture. You're attaching yourself to the schema and the principles. And then you're solving endless problems in your situation. And even greater than your situation, in your entire cities. Engaging in your city and solving problems in your entire cities. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ and how to live in it can solve problems in our cities. And so you're doing theology, tying one hand to the scriptures and the traditioning processes that we're talking about here, and tying your other hand into the culture. And so you're getting pulled like this all the time. So separating from the culture isn't going to be great, because you're not going to understand how to engage in the culture then, because you're not going to know the culture. So being a separatist from the culture isn't the right idea either. And living by a bunch of rules in the scripture side isn't the right idea either. And then what...
Steve Kim says they're making breakthroughs. They're in a meeting.
What's that?
Steve Kim says they're making breakthroughs. They're in a meeting together.
They need to be in here. Tell them to stop it and be in here.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
So...
My battery's running out and this thing's not working. Oh, there it is.
Many of you, well, let's not chase that one either. Do we need to do any more introduction?
Well, I'm a little concerned that we can't do the whole section because it's too much, you know, sometimes you go through this and it's so complex. That's why I'm doing the bullets under the sessions. You know, Mike, go ahead and put that up there, will you? What I mean by that is, like under session 4 are all these things. Principles and processes are before. We may need to do a little reordering. I'm not sure. It really gets complex in this session. And so my worry is that the ground that we've made is getting clear with the overarching and the benchmarks and guys, some of my conversations. Well, one of you came up and said, I wasted my whole life. I said, what do you mean? Because he didn't know this. He couldn't use scripture this way. And so it should have that kind of impact on you. Not that you waste, because I don't remember his name, but he's 62. I'm 72. That means he's got at least 20 years to build that into the next generation. But if it's clicking with you and you've not seen it before, probably begun to see it in the first principles, you begin to realize that, whoa, everything changes. I mean, it's the lens by which I look at everything. This changes. And so moving now to culture, and there's room for flexibility in it, runs the risk of you getting confused again. So I'm going to try to streamline it as much as I can and then tell you what to go back and work on. For example, one of the best illustrations anywhere is Colossians following Ephesians, Colossians being fine-tuned when you get to the household text to look at the slavery issue, and then Paul giving directives to Philemon that are, it's solving a slavery problem within those churches coming off of the household text, and it's a perfect snapshot of doing theology and culture. But the problem with it is you gotta go back to Ephesians, you gotta go back to Colossians, you gotta get the nature of the problem understood, and then you see a beautiful summary of his principles. We can't even touch that. So things aren't, that's one of the clearest. So I am gonna keep the one in here on building the pastoral care, taxonomy, which becomes a good illustration. But anyway, so I'm a little worried about this one.
Well,
That produces a lot of confidence, doesn't it?
well, it's where we're at. Because that slavery one is such to Felix, you were asking the question earlier about not endless problem. You were asking about flexibility. What do we mean by flexibility? Mm-hmm. And that this answers that question from a schema standpoint, because we should be able to attach ourselves to these principles in the framework of these letters and see how Paul actually, we can see how he addressed slavery and what he didn't do and what he did do, what he did talk about. But you have to understand the topos in order to understand that in these sections, in order to get after that one to see what he actually did. And that's,
yeah, in a way, that's a good way of looking at it. See, because I used to use the illustration, it doesn't always communicate that when you have a major answer, a major problem in your network, 90% is going to be you thinking it through in light of the 10% of Scripture that you're given. So you're given the framework, you're given the foundations, but something very complex. And I guess I'll develop on the spot here a little bit the importance of the case study of shepherding counseling. When you're working across a network and in the complicated nature of culture where medicine is moving forward, how you set up a shepherding counseling process or system is not easy to do. But there's a framework of what we call pastoral care taxonomy that comes out of Thessalonians, a few principles, and then a good thinking in your culture to building a complex system that operates within the framework of that. And there might be 90% of the stuff that you put in that system, but it's got to be in the paradigm, it's got to be in the framework, it can't go beyond the principles, and it's got to honor processes inside the church that keep shepherding at a primacy. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of work and a lot of freedom to build to be really effective in the cultural situation and in outreach. So, I think we can capture that. I'm getting there.
okay. All right. Let's. I think that's enough introduction. Let's do session 4 now.
All right. Okay, let's
Yeah. Whoop.
testing. Okay. Session 1 we primarily worked on core hermeneutical overarching concepts. New Theological Encyclopedia, Biblical Theology replaces systematic. Whole bunch of resources we've developed to get you to that point. Hermeneutical process, author's intent, literary design, biblical theology. Hermeneutics, hermeneutically trained judgment, and in community. This lays the foundation for an integrated church-based hermeneutical framework. 4 hermeneutical concepts, not exact steps for each culture. New perspective on Paul, that is, find the original Paul as a coherent thinker. Then we deal with complex topics, overarching subsections and asides, and a traditioning process of moving from schema to principles to process to practices. And it's really important to realize that we're coming back to this one every time, traditioning process. That's the subtitle to the whole book. The traditioning process, schema to principles to process to practices. The schema is the same everywhere if we're accurately getting a hold of it. And the principles are the same. What I mean by that is take the schema of the gathering, 1117 to 1440. Some of the really core principles are between when you come together, the Lord's Supper, and when you come back together, the symposium, are 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. And there's processes, each one bring, not exact processes, but each one bring a teaching, bring a song, and practices like the actual bread and the cup. But when it comes to doing theology in culture, the schema and the principles are the same everywhere. There's some processes that we need to pay attention to, but basically in ministries, in how you're going to work together in churches, how you're going to live in community in the shepherding counseling kind of process, along with the medical world. The processes and practices are going to be mostly things that you invent that's going to work in your cultural situation, because there's flexibility in the processes. There's flexibility in the practices. And that's where we get into trouble when we lock down practices and create a denomination around some of those practices. And we live by them. I mean, I grew up Brethren up to the waist and Baptist from the waist up, which our big issue was the brethren, Grace Brethren, I mean, not the brethren, the Grace Brethren, baptized 3 times forward in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And everybody in those 300 plus churches in the United States baptized this way 3 times. And that was the clear distinction between others that baptized 3 times backwards. And so what we do is we establish a whole list of distinguishing practices that aren't in Scripture. And then we think that those practices become a Baptist tradition, a Methodist tradition, an Anglican tradition. And in reality, we need to be rock solid on schemas, rock solid on the principles, pay attention to any processes that are there or any practices in that tradition delivered to the churches, which are very few, and then recognize that you're in flexible territory when you're creating your own processes and your own practices in culture. Very hard to get a hold of how much freedom there actually is in the way this whole thing is laid out. Okay, then no theology of Paul says you can't lock down Paul in a textbook and say, okay, here's all you need to know about Paul. You got to get to the benchmarks through all of the hard work, get to the benchmarks, and then you've got to start addressing issues in culture, and that's what this session is about. The canonical, okay, so last time in session 3, we started working on the broad framework of Paul's early, middle, and later letters. The traditioning process, the schematics of setting church networks in order. And then we got as far as the literary design. These are benchmarks for establishing churches. And we also touched in the questions on the fact that in these benchmarks, and you're going to see this a little now, you're going to see it a lot tomorrow morning when we're in session 5, that this framework does more than just give you what they need to be established in, like the kerygma and the didache. When you really pay attention to these benchmarks, a lot of them are benchmarks in actually establishing a network, like the Hub Church of Ephesus, the cluster of Lycus Valley, and the strategic partner of Philippi, which I've got outstanding illustration using Colossians and Philemon under the umbrella of Ephesus and how that fits in building a network. But we don't have time really to go into that one, but you're going to see more and more, and especially this session, how to do theology and culture and why so much of that relates to processes and practices. And I've never quite thought of it like this before, but I think it's going to hold. Again, denominations, what happens is they institutionalize processes and practices. They institutionalize the whole process, but they institutionalize processes and practices. Okay, now, and I showed you how we took statements, these complex statements that are topos-based topic statements, and they're really major sections in the letter. So you can actually address the issue, for example, here on Do Our Churches and Church Networks Understand Walking in the Spirit is not a mystical experience and so on, rather than just saying, are they walking in the Spirit, which, unless you define, is so abstract that you can't really do assessment. But if this is what Paul means by walking in the Spirit, and you can see that you're living in the sphere of the Spirit within the kerygma, the didache, the rule of faith, and staying in it and maturing and entering into a lifestyle that way is walking in the Spirit. Then you get rid of the magical and you can assess whether the churches are doing that or not. Otherwise, it's so general that it's worthless. It's totally subjective, I should say, in terms of assessment. And then how you can go from any problems to the session, and you say session 4 is the gospel and walking in the Spirit. Well, our people just don't really understand walking in the Spirit because they all came from this tradition. One tradition may be a very legalistic Baptist tradition. One tradition may be a Pentecostal, a crazy Pentecostal. Not all Pentecostals are crazy, but there are crazy Pentecostals at the one end of the extreme. And so you say, okay, either one of those, you got to understand walking. In fact, you really would go after the really legalistic Baptists or the closed brethren, for example. The closed brethren have so many rules in the different traditions around the world and in Australia that I tried to get into one of them one time in Australia, and there's a big fence around the whole compound, and there's a guard at the gate, and there's little bitty windows at the top so nobody can look in and see what's going on. That's how tight they've circled the wagon and put rules on. And that's what happens. So you go and you say, man, we got to deal with this. So one of them is getting this away from magical, and the other is starting to live by principles and this rule of faith, not a bunch of rules. Okay, now in this session, we want to revisit the topoi and the perspective of Paul's hermeneutic and say, okay, if you're not going to nail down a whole theology of Paul in a textbook, what are you going to do? And so we deal with the theology and culture cycle, encyclicals, varieties of ministries, and we begin addressing issues and problems. And one of them is a big issue related to Philemon and slavery, and the other is a ministry related to the pastoral care taxonomy. So I'm going to just deal with the pastoral care one, and then types of issues and problems. We're going to look at the collection of problems, just in a list form, that he's solving in each one of the three early and middle later sections of Paul's letters. And then we're going to come back to the network assessment guide to begin to list out the problems you need to work with. Now, 2 charts, I'm going to skip those this time. What you need to realize is that if you go back to Kaiser's quote, we may come back to a couple of those. Kaiser's quote is, when it comes to hermeneutics, there's a major paradigm shift emerging that's probably hasn't been revisited the right way since the Reformation. It's a 400-year paradigm shift. What Michael was talking about on those big mega paradigms that shift. And you've really only got 3 options that are going on. Before I read you a couple quotes out of this, one option is that we stay where we are and using the Western hermeneutics, academically based. It's been around for a while. The other is that we develop one unique to our culture. So, we're going to develop an Indian theology on an Indian hermeneutic. We're going to develop an African theology on an African hermeneutic. And the third thing is go back to the way of Christ and the apostles and pick back up that hermeneutic and that process. But the sad thing about the global South, because the West is in very significant decline. Nothing will reverse that. We got several books we've laid out. Jenkins is one that shows the massive growth of the church in the global South, outside the Western paradigm. But what's happening because of so many crazy things like liberation theology dominating almost all of Latin America, the seminaries, the Western seminaries here, Fuller's one of the worst, actually are creating hermeneutical experts for doing a African hermeneutical and African theology result from it, or an Indian one. Now, let me give you an example. Here's a book that was done a couple years ago called Reading the Bible Around the World. And so they take each of these people, one of them's from Africa, one of them's from India, I forget where all they're from, but it's a student's guide to global hermeneutics. Now this sounds really good because we're doing theology and culture, right? So let's learn to think with an African mindset, hermeneutic, and let that be the lens through which we look at things. Now let me tell you where this goes. Learning to do theology and culture is especially key today in light of the decline of the Western institutional church and the emergence of the church in the global South. This can be seen in a new book that just came out this year, back then, Reading the Bible Around the World, A Student's Guide to Hermeneutics by Frederick Alpha Roth and multiple authors. Each chapter is written from an emerging theologian from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Asia, but trained by Western theologians and professors, themselves serving as professors either at Fuller Theological Seminary or Azusa Pacific in religious studies and practical theology. They are a complete hermeneutical disaster. That's my quote. All right? They start with their own culture and read into the text without first going back to the apostolic traditioning of Paul. Now, these are the experts, and each of the seminaries are developing a similar platform. So these are the ones that then the unestablished Global South Church invites in to do the seminars to teach them how to interpret. And so you realize that stream, people are going to flock to that in any country that you're going into, because here's an expert that now is even a professor at Fuller, just devoted to African theology so you can really see things through an African eye. Extremely attractive. It's going on everywhere. Now, the problem is theology and culture cycle. Latin America starts with their culture. Latin America starts with liberation theology. Africa starts a lot of places with a womanist theology. Europe and North America with a non-white man's theology. Asia with an inferior versus superior, and a lot of diaspora is liberation theology from the displaced people. So Fuller Seminary and Azusa are totally lost, yet they're setting up this paradigm. Now, here's a quote. This is from African Approaches by Alice, and a number of you in here are from Africa, so you'll know I'm butchering this. Yafade? Is that close? Not bad? Yafade? A PhD, a Princeton PhD, and on the faculty of Azusa Pacific in biblical studies and religious and practical theology. Now, that's going to be a direct hit for our African countries, because not only at Azusa, which is really the college related to which one is it? What was I talking about? Fuller. Here's her quotes. The consensus among African biblical scholars. First of all, consensus. This is what generally all of the African theologians have concluded. No reason to debate this. Let me just give you what you need to know. The consensus among African biblical scholars, continental and diasporic alike, brought in all the diaspora, is that the African context the African context and the African lived realities serve as a starting point for the primary subject of biblical interpretation. So we're going to start with the culture. Now, look at what she calls herself. Another quote. She's defining herself as a diaspora, Afro-feminist, womanist scholar. With hyphenated identity, I locate my hermeneutical lens within the multiple facet of Afro-womanist, feminist selfhood. You understand the significance of that? Anybody that follows that's completely lost. They're going to start with that lens. And that's as creative as I've ever seen. 3 points. Afro-feminist, womanist scholar, hyphenated, that's my core identity. And it's a hermeneutical lens with a multifaceted space. So that's space, remember, for the topos. So this is the topos that lays the whole foundation. And Western seminaries in every single one of the Global South civilizations are preparing people that think like this to take the interpretation in. You realize that will completely destabilize entire movements that are growing up fast, that are untaught and unestablished. So learning to do theology and culture is very, very important. But we go through the lens of the apostolic traditioning and that topos. Then we go to culture. Okay, so that means we've got 3 choices. One choice is stay with the Western institutional Paul, like Reformed theology, who are fighting the new perspective of Paul globally and clinging on to their dying traditions. Second is to start a whole new tradition, beginning with interpreting the Bible through one's own cultural eyes, all following a vision of liberation theology, without first going back to apostolic teaching, which we now call, the apostolic tradition of Paul. Or we go back to the new perspective on Paul, back to the original Paul of the New Testament, and begin with Christ's design for his churches in every cultural era. This is the current landscape of global conversation of doing theology in culture. One is dying, the other is totally lost in culture, and the third is actually returning to the way of Christ and the apostles. While I'm a sympathizer to number 2, reading the Bible through the eyes of the cultural context, Western theologians have so incompetently trained them that now options 1 and 2 are completely have lost the apostolic traditioning. That's what's at stake. So when you say theology and culture, and you're talking about the different cultures of the Global South, in our Western seminaries, you're talking about people there preparing to start with the lens of their culture rather than the lens of the apostolic tradition. And they're everywhere. Okay, so the motto I would like to address is the issue of Philemon, where Paul is dealing with the whole slavery issue, and with Philemon being a master, being a significant part of the Colossae network, and Onesiphorus leaving and coming to Paul, and Paul discipling him. And so now, how does Paul relate back in light of the household text, husbands, wives, parents, children, master slaves? So he gives the general framework, masters and slaves, that kind of is the generic one out of Ephesians, the manifesto. Then he twists a bit, not twists, but he takes a piece of that and narrows it a bit so it lays the foundation for dealing with Philemon and Onesiphorus. And then he actually reminds them of the foundation, and then he just gives advice he gives instruction to how the Colossian church should think about it, how Onesiphorus should think about it, and how Philemon should think about it. Is that right? Am I saying that right? Onesiphorus? Onesimus, right? Onesimus? Then, now, Onesiphorus will never leave my brain, at this stage. It's stuck there. Onesimus. This is extremely important because today, when we're dealing with the cultural move from the global south, with immigration, with diaspora everywhere, with the different class systems that relate around all of that, how to think about that as churches moves right across to today. And there's not a complete right and wrong answer to a number of these things, but you see him deal with a real important situation. So I have to skip that, but all the instructions you need are in there. So how do we go about this process? In other words, how do we go about doing theology and culture of the new perspective on Paul? One is you have to, and this is what we've been doing, you have to master the Pauline corpus. Studying the overarching topoi, the subsections, the asides, by paying attention to Paul's intention for each letter, and clusters, and finding literary design marking, and mastering all the issues and problems he deals with in his churches. So that takes you to the benchmarks on the literary design, and then it takes you to a point of saying, okay, what are the issues that are plaguing your networks and your churches? Eventually, you'll be cataloging them, and that's the process we take you through. The second is you identify issues and problems in your churches that need to be addressed, along with ministries that need to be aligned with Paul's traditioning process of establishing churches according to Christ's design. Then you produce papers or articles identifying overarching schema, identify principles, processes, and practices consistent with the traditioning of Paul, making sure everything that is being taught in culture or created in culture is consistent. Now, some of these are small and some of them are big. Let's see, where do I go? Yeah, okay, good. So you take, for example, the big problem that's one of the big problems that's facing our church today is around the area of shepherding and counseling and professional counseling, but not only professional counseling, the psychologists, but all the mental disorders and the medical side of all of that. Now, we're not going to circle the wagons and say that we're throwing out psychiatrists who are medical doctors, but what's happened is a paradigm has emerged called Christian it has Christian professionals, psychologists, but I refer to it as the psychological care paradigm. It's been developing for around 40 years, and most of the mega churches don't basically either in-house, they bring in in-house psychologists or psychiatrists, or they develop a relationship with outside Christian practices. And it changes everything, because now the elders are out of the game of the true shepherding and counseling. And so how do you, in light of all the advances in science, in light of psychiatric discoveries and good medicine and everything that goes with that, how do you design a shepherding counseling in the real world that on one hand will line up with the way of Christ and the apostles, keep the church leaders driving the bus, and yet be fully engaged in culture and even in an outreach fashion, let alone people that might be Christians that are taking some of those professions? It's a very complicated thing. And you say, well, that's a Western problem. It's not a Western problem, because I saw this pre-COVID, about 2015, that several organizations were bringing the psychological care paradigm aggressively into India. And there's a great confusion with the churches in relation to this. That's a big example of we have to structure ministries around the traditioning process. And that's not easy. You can't just take them wholesale. What do I mean by that, by producing papers and articles? One thing I mean by it is like the encyclicals. I didn't give you a biblical theology of Paul in the encyclicals. You've got 9 papers in the encyclicals. They're not like 9 steps to establishing a network of churches, but they're 9 key pieces that you keep circling around the issue of building the way of Christ and the apostles into your networks. But they all relate to problems and issues. Encyclical 1, the Western discipleship movements and the individual discipling model that is dumped all over the global South takes you completely the wrong direction in terms of what it means to establish and mature believers in the context of a family of families. Realigning ministry. Here, you've got to learn what apostolic ministries are, and so you're either aligning the ministry because you're creating it when you're building your apostolic network, or if you're a denomination, you're realigning it now to the way of Christ and the apostles, which I've never seen happen, by the way. I'm not aware of a single denomination that's well established that have been able to reinvent themselves back to the way of Christ and the apostles. I've seen a lot of renewal on the front end, but eventually they're spun off their denomination. The issue of women and leadership in ministry, great confusion in much of the global South. Issues of the problem of evangelism. You remember I deal with the old paradigm and move to the new in each of these. The issue and problem of fund development all the way to relief development problems. Number 7, the issue of professional ministry as opposed to uneducated apostles. Aligning, number 8 is apostolic networks. Now, aligning and redesigning ministry, really building on number 2. And the last one is aligning or redesigning the Sunday meeting, which is the hardest to change. Anything we've done, that's the hardest to change, to break apart the Western church service. But you see how every one of those, and I'm not doing white papers right now, or the Paradigm Insight papers. Michael's doing the global dialogues, and they're all designed to take off from one of the encyclicals, or 2 of them, and move to implementation in that redesigning process. Now, one of the biggest influences on me is Luke Timothy Johnson's work. Beautiful job in looking at the different clustering of Paul's letters and so on. But then you come to this book, which is 576 pages, and there's one, how far does he go? There's all the way to 23 papers in the back of this. And he starts off by saying, this was my quote from Monday, he starts off by saying, you know, maybe I'm just lazy, but I don't think anybody can write a New Testament theology of Paul. And if you write a New Testament theology of Paul, you lock down people studying that theology rather than going back through the process. And so what he's got is 23 articles. What's very interesting about the example here is that in these articles he moves from the early, middle, and later letters of Paul. Like one is truth and reconciliation in 2 Corinthians. Fellowship and suffering, discernment. He just moves through them, and you've got, I have them up here, don't I? Yeah, transforming the mind and moral discernment, life-giving spirit, fellowship of suffering, the true Christian experience, the apostle as crisis manager, the shape of the struggle. These are all taking things like the fellowship of suffering and looking at a key passage in the context of the unfolding letters and then unfolding it into relevant application today. So this is an example of that. Another one that I really love is Paul and the Greco-Roman World, which has now grown to 2 volumes, and this is the one that has a Parrhesia chapter in it, Frank's speech. And so they take certain ideas, like they base that Frank's speech primarily out of 2 Corinthians, especially 10 to 13. But then they unfold it through his letters. And then you develop an understanding that greatly strengthens the idea of Frank's speech, Parrhesia, that's supposed to be part of our gatherings. I lost my... The reason why I'm going into this, Paul and commendation. What about, remember when Paul says, my commendation is not letters of recommendation, it's not degrees and so on, it's you, the church that I've established. That's a whole paradigm related to commendation. And together with that, we're supposed to lay our hands on certain leaders, like key elders, like the Timothy's and Titus's, and then letters of commendation are actually embedded into all of his sections where he's commending certain leaders to the churches he's sending them to. Commendation is a very important thing, but we've completely screwed it up with our Western degree system. Now, you can do it right, but you got to realign it. Paul and Frank's speech, Paul and friendship, Paul and honor and shame, very important in Asian cultures. And then Paul, virtue, vices, and the household codes. All those things can be developed out. And then beyond that, you begin developing, I'll give it back to you. Beyond that, you then begin dealing with very specific cultural situations. An example of that is what Michael did in the dialogue paper when we had to deal with Western boards versus church-based leadership assessment and decision-making. Now, I was going to take on Colossians, but I will take, it's just too complicated and too little time. So we're going to look briefly at the Thessalonian correspondence and how Paul shaped pastoral care perspective of ministry. Let's see, so we're going to skip all of this, sorry. So that's an example of directly doing theology and culture, the Onesimus Philemon one. Very, very helpful. But now let's turn from a model of doing theology around issues and problems to aligning or ending existing ministries and design new needed ministries in our networks. We're going to begin the process by looking at realigning or redesigning ministries. Encyclical 5, designed around our fund development paradigm. What in the? Then we'll look at Paul. Let's skip that. Oh, it's not there. Oh. Well, let's put your. Can you put the paper up? We got the wrong slide set. What's that? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, jeez. It's in the wrong place. All right. This is in your book, probably about page 87, if you can't read that. Can you read that back there? 50-50. How about this table? Can you read it? Okay. Then the back table, you'll have to look at your book. I got to have it like this because my mind... What is it? 88. Okay, page 88. My I just can't see the ideas because I'm trained on this chart, which I like much better. Okay, so what we're talking about is framework for aligning and redesigning existing ministries or new ministries. And this involves a process of moving from Paul's schema to principles to processes to practices. Now, the reason why this is so important is some of you are building grassroots, like particularly what's going on in the Islamic world. And you're working with the MBBs, and they're totally unestablished, and you're starting from the ground up. And in North India, 35,000 churches in a decade period with Operation Agape, for example. Flat, first generation, no real hierarchy or anything yet. But almost all the world, you've heard me use this before, the 747 is already in the air. The 5 families, the house churches in China, one of them is 3 million. And they're now just entering the end of their second and the beginning of their third generation. And many of you have large either denominational or church planting ministries, but they're attached to denominations. So when we come at this problem, and Western money is tied to Western institutions, and this is the way you do it. Now, what do I mean by an institutionalized church? An institutionalized church is Western institutionalized programs on the left-hand column. The programs is to cause an activity to be automatically regulated and prescribed in a certain way, also in extended use. So a program is automatically regulated. You don't have to worry about doing theology and culture because the program tells you everything you need to know and will regulate your activity. And you have rules. That's a code of discipline or body of regulations observed by a religious order or congregation, the order or congregation itself. Policies to organize, order, or regulate a state or country, and procedures are a set of instructions of performing the specific task which may be involved in the course of a program or a subroutine. Okay, so then you have all the way down to this is exactly how you do the task. Denominations, seminary schools, many mission agencies, and parachurch organizations of the West are primarily on the left. When you go to the right, it's tough. Because all of a sudden, you're in a whole new world. The Paul's schematic approach, Paul used schemas, that is frameworks, grand strategy, overall strategy for ministry as seen in the later letters, like 1 Timothy 3, 14, and 15. Principles, Paul laid the foundation for the work of the ministry in what he calls the first principles of the faith. Processes, Paul laid out processes for ministry practices as illustrated in the gathering topos. When you gather together, this is the process. And then the last thing is a few practices. Paul gave very few practices that needed to be followed specifically, like the bread and the cup at the beginning and end of the supper. Now, the reason why this is important is people, let's say you get all kinds of divisions that are starting in your church or churches. And Paul listed out a handful of divisions in the communities and a handful of divisions in the gathering. But what happens is people go back to what Paul commanded or how he talked them through the problem and institutionalize it by arguing that, therefore, what he was giving was a very rigid rule that fit into a policy that fit into a particular program, and nobody can agree on them. So you create denomination after denomination after denomination in how they specifically solve according to the left-hand side here. we've got to learn how to work on the right-hand side. Now, yeah, let's try this. Evaluating existing ministries in light of the two charts. We're going to look at, I didn't get clear. Let me read the second. Realign the existing ministries or design a new ministry with an overall schema framework consistent with Paul's traditioning process. Then identify the core principles and the needed practices that you would follow. Keep the practices as few as possible. And then involve key apostolic leaders and senior elders in the process, even if it is primarily a sodal ministry enterprise, taking care not to cross over to a Western institutional programmatic design. It's not an easy process. Now, the issue that we want to look at here, the problem in shepherding counseling, the issue is the need to establish a pastoral care paradigm aligned with the traditioning of Paul rather than our culture's psychological care paradigm. There was a need for a more fully developed shepherding counseling process in our churches. Now, ministry alignment. How are we going to begin aligning that ministry? Now, working it out in detail in a culture is going to vary. How we interact with the medical world and the categorization of emotional problem stuff is going to be different in the U.S. than it is going to be in China, because they aren't even called the same things in most cases, like a psychiatrist. So, just quickly looking at the outline of reframing this, we started with one page from the encyclical. The schema is the pastoral care taxonomy. Now, what's important about all the schemas that we've given you here that are the benchmarks in the different areas, we have researched very, very carefully, not only the intention of the author and the literary design, but to really understand it in many cases, it's deeply enhanced by all the Greco-Roman research of the last 40 years. So there's not any significant Greco-Roman research that I'm aware of, and it's massive, related to Paul's letters that I'm not aware of. And that's taken exhaustive work to be able to do that. But and a lot of times there's a key author. And like Mallarby at Yale spent his life studying Thessalonians. He studied all the New Testament and developed some, but he spent his life studying 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And he developed a very well-researched model building in Thessalonians, that's right there in Thessalonians, called what we call the pastoral care taxonomy. And in that taxonomy, we have one page that we've developed that's the schema, that's the framework. The philosophic, and guided by a lot of his work, the philosophical tradition of pastoral care. Now there's principles, and principles using that taxonomy, there are principles given to elders in shepherding. But there are also principles that go all the way down to counseling one another. And so we have a continuum of the processes to the primary responsibility and oversight of a senior eldership, to teams that are helping them, that are elders, deacons, and leading women of churches, down to those that are to a one another ministry that happens in our churches. So the process, which can't be turned into a bunch of rules and regulations, the process has to be understood in light of the social structure that's laid out in those pastoral letters. Because you can't just have elders, senior elders counseling and nobody else can counsel, but you also have to have a one another ministry that you don't try to control, but you establish people. So there's got to be a set of processes, and ours, the process we created, is a very useful tool. We've worked with it now, been developing it for decades, will be you encourage your churches to counsel one another. But when there's a significant problem, then you first go to the elder, deacon, or leading woman in your church. And then if the problem is more, then you go to the senior elder in the cluster. And then we have a process of still keeping in, being able to shepherd, but you need, a lot of times there's medical help that might be needed or significant psychological problems. But in the context of that paradigm then, we have from the process to how we engage people that we use psychiatrists for or send to medical doctors, where the shepherds can still be overseeing the whole thing. And in our culture, one of the practices that we have is that if we're counseling and shepherding a person and there's outside help that's needed, when we send them to that outside help, we ask them to sign saying that the records and what's discovered will be sent to the elders that is responsible for overseeing them. And we've never been turned down, at this stage. That's a specific practice, but paying attention to the schema, the principles, and a process that you educate the whole church on. Now that's very different than saying our churches are ill-equipped, so now we got a new industry of professional psychologists, and either we'll hire them in-house if we're a big mega church, or we'll send them out otherwise, and we don't have to worry about it. We're done with that level of shepherding. The problem with that is then we built a rebuild program where we'll help people when their life falls apart rebuild over a 3-year period, which also at times involves government services that might be helpful. But the government services can't establish a person in their faith. They can't rebuild them as they're not a family of families. So as we interact with the culture, and if we have good answers and our churches are equipped, all of a sudden the culture will look at us and say, whoa, those people know what they're doing. But it takes very careful alignment. And so this is an example of that process. We developed a shepherding counseling manual around Paul's traditioning process, schematic principles, process, and practices. We designed an executive education 9-week training to take senior elders through that and adjust the manual and contributions. We extended the 9-week executive education to all of our 90 house church leaders in 3-hour bi-weekly sessions, which are coming up actually. We incorporated our life rebuilding ministry into the counselor training manual as more intense 3-year life rebuilding ministry, aligning it carefully with our shepherding and counseling ministry. And we informed small modal leadership teams to build professional partnerships in our community in 3 spheres: partnerships with the medical professionals, community government programs, and judges and probation officers. Now we got a couple of probation officers, because they know that they can't solve anything. When somebody's been in prison, they let them out. Will you put them in your rebuild program? So we're actually now gaining a reputation in the community because we can deliver because of God's design. We've had a couple judge situations where they've bypassed a sentence and entrusted them to us. And we have our preferred, like Mayo Clinic, we might send someone for a psychological and physical evaluation because it's one of the best in the country. But we get it. They sign it, and it's released, and we get it. So we've got increased training to be able to stay on top of this, but it takes very careful alignment. And so we're going to have a lot of opportunity for ministries. Once you learn this and your networks are established, what are going to be some of your impact ministries in your network and in your culture that you're going to design and work with? And most of those aren't done overnight. Now, virtually all Western parachurch organizations, boy, this is a hard-hitting statement. Maybe I won't realigning with. Virtually all Western parachurch organizations do not align with Christ's grand strategy, nor do they align with the traditioning process. It is possible to realign them, but most are not open to such a process. I've tried for 50 years. Leading, and in all situations, I don't care whether it's a Wycliffe or whether it's the New Life Counseling Centers out of Minirth-Meyer, spent quite a bit of time there that are all over the country. We've tried to renew in all of these situations. Seminaries, virtually all Western parachurch organizations do not align with Christ's grand strategy, nor Paul's apostolic traditioning process. It's possible to realign them, but most are not open to such a process. Leaders of networks, especially in the Global South, need to either realign partnerships with them or protect their networks from their ministries altogether. My 6 paradigm papers and 10 encyclicals provide guidance. The 7 Western paradigm parachurch entities that need major realignment, church networks driving the bus, are the 30,000 plus Western denominations, relief development organizations taking $6 billion out of our churches, discipleship organizations, 22 of them pump their strategies into the Global South, Western mission agencies, seminaries, psychological care ministries, and even Christian schools and colleges are not aligned with the paradigm in most cases. So you begin to say, man, so now I got to work 10 years and get our network established, 5 years laying the base where we're building a complex apostolic team and senior elders around hubs and everybody learning the first principles and establishing these gatherings. And then a plan to, now that we have a base, double in the next 5 years. In the meantime, now you're saying that I can't hardly use anything of major ministries from the West. That's what I'm saying. You bring them in at your own peril because it's a different paradigm. It's oil and water. And so part of us is to help give you tools to realign this. We're not telling you the detailed processes and practices in the psychological care paradigm in China because the situation is different. The medical world is different. But we are working with the same framework and getting you to the point then of beginning to build. And we do that in all of these. So doing theology and culture, what we're talking about is assess the issues or problems that need to be addressed. This is often comprehensive, and especially for your network of churches, like writing the paradigm papers and encyclicals and global dialogue papers, and aligning and designing or recreate ministries in your church network. In the early, middle, and later letters give us the schema, the framework of Paul's processes for establishing churches. They show us how he addressed problems and thought through issues according to Christ's grand strategy as he was taught by the Spirit. They teach us Paul's traditioning process. But the letters could not possibly address every problem that the church has encountered down through the century and culture of 2,000 plus years. So we're going to look back at a quick list of the types of problems Paul addressed and solved in his collection of letters. The list from MTS will give you a starting point for the issues and problems you need to address. And there's just a couple slides on this, but the early letters. What are the problems he addressed? Distortions of the gospel, dramatic embracing of the gospel but not rooted, cultural stratification and divisions in new believers, like the caste system, additions to the gospel, legalistic systems attached to the gospel and arising around them, principles of other religious systems mixed in with the gospel, early emerging error arising from incomplete understanding of the gospel, failure to attach the gospel to the kingdom narrative, and church cliques following individual leaders over others. That's the rainbow list of problems. In the middle letters, a failure to grasp Christ's grand strategy, a lack of one-mindedness, co-workers fighting with each other, and slavery issues. And the later letters, failure to complete the process of establishing the churches in a new network, appointing unqualified elders, failing to care for widows in the family social structure of Christ's design, women who disrupt churches by their failure to understand the household community text, men who get involved in political causes above Christ's purposes, nationalism, elders failing to confront false teaching, following leaders who break unity of the church with endless theological arguments and worthless debates that divide believers and churches. Isn't that an amazing list? It's actually a pretty complete list. And so we take you through a process. Do you have any of these? Issues emerging, ministries of alignment, new ministries need to be created, etc. And ultimately then, your discussion is, what exactly is Paul's process for doing theology in real time, in culture, in the process of establishing churches? How does Paul's handling of slavery in the Colossian churches set a model for doing theology and culture today? How can we build ministries rooted in the traditioning process in our churches and networks today, avoiding institutionalization of these ministries like the West does. And what problems, issues and problems in your church are not in alignment with the traditioning process and need to be addressed? Are there ministries that are not aligned with the process? Are there ministries that need to be created or shut down? Now, that basically covers it. There's one thing I wanted to conclude with, and I forgot. Let's just stop there. You know, it's boy, I wish we had a whole day, and you had Colossians and Philemon in your hands, and we worked through that because it's absolutely brilliant what Paul did. He addressed it in a way that honored the political authorities of the day. He addressed it in a way that honored Onesimus, that honored Philemon, and what he asked Philemon to do that he wouldn't have had. How he handled that cultural problems on the basis of the manifesto of the centrality of Christ's church and the household text is phenomenal. Yeah, boy, it's a lot of stuff.
It is a lot of stuff. But
how many times have you heard it, and what stands out to you
yeah,
from this time?
how many times have I heard it? Not that many. 3? 2? 3?
More in depth like this, with all my antics surrounding it.
Well, and especially with yesterday and then today, all in a quick.
Yeah, it's been helpful for me. I haven't seen it compressed and taught like that, one right after another.
There is something about getting it all at once that you're able to, I think, see the whole forest. What stands out to me yet in this is still the option that we have in our. You gave us. There's 3 options that we can do as we address issues in all of our unique cultures and unique situations, and that is, we can use the paradigm of the present in Christendom. We can create a new one, liberation theology, or the example you give of those, her 3 hyphenated names, or we can go back to go back to the traditioning process, go back and master that traditioning process, and then flexibly solve problems in our culture. I think just hearing that again is invigorating, because I think you can make sense of the New Testament. You can see the New Testament. You can actually master the framework of the New Testament, and you can actually solve problems in our communities.
And you can address any cultural issue or ministry that is affecting your church or allows you to be able to develop effective ministry in the church or network or the culture.
Yeah. I could see us in future days having times where we'll have entire days or a conference dedicated to what we're talking about here. But you've got to first, I can see that coming up. I can see that in the years ahead. But all of us have to first master Paul's traditioning process. So we're not there yet. We're not up on that part of the curve quite yet. But we can get there.
Sorry, a little distracting.
What
I envision is, take a look at this before the time's out. This is just a remarkable document, no theology of Paul. But I envision in 10 years from now, when we got these networks established and all of you've done your hard work to get your certificates or degrees, if that's part of it, I envision a 24-article volume from Africa. I envision a 24-volume from India, a 24-volume from China, where we're all working on the same paradigm, but addressing the issues in our culture. Even if, but can you imagine what that would do to begin to develop a one-mindedness of the emerging Christendom, but also a one-mindedness in your given civilization and an inner working
Yep.
together would be, but I mean, I can see that. In fact, I can see some of the people in this right now.
Yeah, and that's, if you go back, Jeff, to our intentions 5, 10, 15 years ago, we couldn't quite get there with our leadership series. But that was the point. The intention before, those of you that have been around for a while, we wanted to get to that exact point where you're creating those type of theology and culture artifacts, but we couldn't get there because there wasn't enough, there's not enough framework of mastering Paul's system in the leadership courses. I guess I just said the same thing twice, but I think with author's intent, literary design, more the way the MTS is structured, now we can get there. Now we can get there. I hope some of you that are familiar with the leadership series know the difference I'm talking about, I guess. All right, let's take just a moment again. I can tell by 70% of your body language that you've drank enough. So let's rapid fire. Tell us one or two things that you've learned. And if you ask a question of us, then George has the right to throw a tomato at you, maybe.
But stay on the big picture. Don't ask a question about some particular detail of Onesimus. All right.
One or two things you're learning. Then we'll take a break, and then we got an idea for the last hour. All right, right up here, blue shirt, Jorge.
I know more the mystery,
You know more of the mystery,
the church mystery.
the church mystery.
He knows what.
And drop the mic. That's all you got. Wow, that is good. He knows. I assume he knows more of the mystery of the church. Yeah. The mystery is. I assume the mystery is unfolding for you, becoming clearer.
I only reached the level that Jews and Gentile, and now I know more about the real mystery for this age, for this time. I can see a real church ready for the second
real church.
coming.
Yep. We've been saying in Latin America, and you've said this, and we said it back and forth to each other. Leaders solve problems. Leaders don't make excuses about their culture and why this won't work in their culture. Leaders solve problems. Well, in the context of what we're talking about here, leaders solve problems in their culture. Leaders solve problems in their churches. But you do it by tying yourself to Paul's acumen, the skill that Christ left us in the framework. We don't do it because, oh, man, you're so skilled and you're so smart and you can read a lot. Yay. No, it's because all of us are tied to the way. It's so impactful in this conference. What's really impacting me is how in Islam they have the way. And it's almost embarrassing as a Christian to think about what our collective way is. Just a bunch of people showing up for an hour every Sunday morning. That's our way. Yikes. Who else? What else are you learning? What else? Right up here. This table gets 1,000 points because every time they've.
I appreciate a lot, Jeff, the framework of realign or redesign the ministry. You know, we have schools, and we start to try to implement this process, but now I understand. I understand the schema, principle, process, and practice. And this is very helpful for my ministry in this moment because I need to redesign the schools. And this is very, very powerful tool for us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Felix, it is Felix,
It's
right?
Felix, yeah.
You guys in Latin America have a really big problem. And that is that the West is sitting right on top of you. You know, it's a little harder to get to Africa. They won't let you in China, but the entire Western system just plows right down through. So you got two problems. You got the entire Western system, which screws up all of evangelicalism, and then you've got the Catholics that bought into liberation theology and all the countries that are becoming essentially Marxist, you know, in it. And so you got some big realignment, you know, and that's why probably many of the things just can't be realigned. So in other words, if you've got leaders, like we did this with ECI, really, it's been really difficult to realign ECI, which is Anglican in relation to all this. But Bishop Ezra had the vision of training 30,000 church planners and planning 100,000 house churches and leveraging ECI, you know, against it. Well, if we'd have focused on we have to realign and renew the Anglican side of that thing, you wouldn't go anywhere. So setting prototypes is probably going to be far more worth your time, because the big harvest has come with evangelism, you know, in Latin America. And the harvest has been ruined from several angles. So that puts you in a renewal, which I know is what you guys are doing. You're building a team, apostolic team for Latin America, and building carefully. But if you understand these things, it affects your grand strategy and what your approach is. Because I spent a lot of time thinking I could renew things. And so I sold enough blue sky that I'd get invited into seminaries and mission agencies and relief development organizations and everything else that you can't get anywhere. You know, you can't win.
What else? What about this side of the room? What are you learning? Luke, right over here. Cruz, I can tell by your body language you really want to get points for this side of the room, but
I'm learning that we need to get our schema right before we start building principles and procedures and practices and principles. Because if our schema is wrong, then all those other things are going to be off-kiltered as well. So what we're trying to do usually is like we're trying to build practices and principles, and we're saying that they're biblical, and we'll just grab some random Bible verse from somewhere and saying, hey, look, we've now built this practice, and it's biblical, and it's actually built on the whole wrong schema. And so we need to get back to getting the right schema right, and then we can start looking at our practices and our principles.
Yep. Beautiful.
And you know, the schema, another way of looking at the schema is, again, the way of Christ and the apostles. When you look at Hebrews, we've seen this way appear so many times, like Sunni and so on, but when you see it, there was a way of the old covenant. Mm-hmm. You know, a way to walk, a way to raise your children, teach them to sit in the house, walk by. There was a way in the covenant, but it was a mere shadow of the new and living way that was coming. So Hebrews contrasts the two ways and talks about the fact that the whole idea of the new covenant and what Jesus inaugurated that at the Lord's Supper, where this is the new covenant in my blood, do this in remembrance of me. So we're entering into a whole new way. And that way is a system, because, and again, you got to understand that, but a way is actually a system. There is a social, a social household system.
Social structure.
Yeah. And there is, so there's a way, but that way isn't rigid like the way in the law to protect things. But that way has schemas, principles, in it. And that's why the way of Christ and the apostles is a very good term. We didn't do that. Roland Allen's the one that brought that forward in his works 100 years ago when he was in China. But it's all over the New Testament. And then you look at this process, and we're even using the words of Paul, and trying to put together that schema by showing how he did it with the gathering and several others. So very important that you got to have that in place.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it is, I've said it 100 times, I'll say it 101 times. It's a rewarding process to tie yourself to the schema. It's very rewarding. I think you get more conflicts because two things I think happen. You see more yourself, you're able to see and understand more things that are happening, that are actually going to happen anyway, but you're able to, almost in a prophetic way, you can see and understand more about where this is headed. And I think the other thing is you become more useful, and thus you become more of a target, and you get more arrows. So it's not easier in that sense. It's a lot harder, but I think it's very rewarding. I mean, I just wouldn't see us doing anything else. Good and faithful servant. Okay, Brian, you stretching or you got something? No, you don't want to the microphone. All right. All right, take a break. Come back again in 15 minutes. Very briefly, you're going to hear what they're up to and get an opportunity to ask them a question or two. And then what we'll do the rest of the time is we're going to have you, I'm just planting seeds for you now, but we will take this assessment guide, and we'd like you to use this assessment guide and have you think of your leadership team maybe, think of your church, maybe think of your church network, think of a situation that's real, and use the early letters, and I'll show you what pages they're on, of this guide, and do a brief assessment. We'll give you some time to do that. And then on the other side of you taking the time to do that, then we'd like you to share it. We'll take time, we'll just pass the microphone around. Maybe ideally, if you're going to share, you could take a picture of it or two, and even text it to me, and then I can share it up on the screen maybe. But we can figure that out as we go along. But we want you to begin to use the guide, the assessment, the comprehensive assessment guide, okay? So that's what's left for us for the last hour here. So before we do that, this is James, and this is Isaac. You can tell them apart because one of them dressed up a lot with shorts in the wintertime. And these guys we've been very intentional about investing into the third generation. We did a whole year worth of meetings. After that, before that rather, we had an apprenticeship academy, which is all about getting, understanding your life work. Before you leave high school, that actually understanding more about what your life work is about, your unique life gifts in the apprenticeship academy. And a third strategy we had was actually to meet with some of the young men, not all of them, but some of them, at separate times and over at one of our homes, and we would just talk about life, and we would challenge them to contend and push them around the edges to get their life together, talk about life issues, and talk about what it means to really be a leader in today's world and to still hold on to the schema, start dedicating themselves to the schema. So these are two leaders that are emerging, and they are leading our Envision Life, which is our Will you explain it in the slide? So I'll give it to you guys.
Yeah, so is this on? Yeah. I'm James, and this is Isaac, and we're going to give you a little 5-minute walkthrough of some of the story behind our youth efforts, and also an open invitation to all of you to come and see what we're doing. Isaac's already spoken to 4 or 5 of you that we're going to give a brief little interview to kind of frame in some civilizational type stuff for our younger kids, so they can have a chance to put some faces to some names and figure out where you guys are on the map. So we'll give a bit of the story here. So during the summer, Isaac and I met with Jeff and Michael to discuss a new direction for our youth efforts, and we decided to move in the direction of peer-to-peer leadership, which is why we're standing here right now, because of the highly motivating and engaging nature of it. Third-gen leaders, us, must be commissioned to take ownership of our personal growth and the development of our peers, while older leaders, Jeff and Michael, are still around to shape and guide us. So we have taken some initiative to help our peers start to figure out some things about their lives and pursue their own development, while also leading by example and taking our development seriously. Like you'll see later on that we're doing identifying and life to the nth for our high schoolers because of how much those tools impacted Isaac and I in our own personal journeys.
Yeah, so part of us restructuring our youth is we originally had a youth group, so we kind of changed a lot of names, and we are now referred to as Envision Life. We decided to change it just off of, that first thought of when you hear a youth group, you're not necessarily going to think of what we're doing. Think of more of a Western traditional youth group. And we wanted to root the way of Christ and His apostles in what we're doing and weekly and things like that. So changed our name to reflect that.
So during the first half of the school year, the high schoolers were led through the fundamentals of TWBCA as I and Isaac worked to build some slideshows to kind of synthesize some fundamental terms, some vocabulary. Even though the vast majority of our young people have been raised in this paradigm their entire lives, some gaps will always exist. So we decided to cover things at a quick pace and a high level to kind of make sure everyone and some new girlfriends and boyfriends could get the fundamentals and the vocabulary. I have slideshows. If any of you are interested in what we had covered, just feel free to ask, and we'll be glad to tell. After we covered the fundamentals, we decided to move on to using build resources to further establish and orient everyone in the stage of our lives.
Yeah, so we're currently in that second half period. So we've commissioned some of our peers our age to lead the middle school group through the story. It's a wonderful resource. And then currently we're working through identifying, like James mentioned. So one of our senior elders, Aaron Keller, he's one of the most skilled at leading groups through that. So we had convinced him to help do that. And then Jay as well will be leading us through life to the nth. But part of that is kind of transitioned into more life development and kind of capturing that older high school age range to be able to make key life decisions around the paradigm.
As I mentioned a bit earlier, tonight at 6:30, please feel free to come and experience what we do tonight starting at 6:30. We have spoken to 4 of you, and we're going to interview you promptly at 6:30.
Promptly,
as I
of
talked
course,
about.
at 6:30.
Yeah, we have some people
Promptly, George. Promptly.
that tend to run a bit late, and one of them is standing to my right now. After that, the young adults will go off to their studies, and Isaac and I will stay in the auditorium here to answer questions from you all. I've been here I've been here throughout this conference, and a lot of you have had questions for me. So we wanted to give you a chance to grill the both of us to see what we're thinking. So yeah, feel free to join us at 6:30.
So some of you may know this already, but James's father is Nathan and Stephanie, and then James's grandmother, so thanks for laughing, that was funny, is John and Mary Hala. So John and Mary are a senior elder in our church network. And then Isaac's parents are Eric and Lene, who grew up here. And then his grandma and grandfather are Don and Lillian. Don and Lillian are also a senior elder. In fact, the city elder in our network. So, third generation through and through. Now, comments or any questions for these guys?
We are going to field questions.
We're going to field questions later, but any, you don't want to do any live ones now?
You gave us 6.5 minutes, so we're there.
I gave you 6.5 minutes
Hey,
to do what you're
if
doing.
he's extending your time, take it.
I told him earlier they had 6.5 minutes, which is an imprecise number for a
It'd be really good if somebody would ask a hard question that might fluster them, so we
There you
can
go.
see how they handle it. Uh-oh.
You have a microphone or Renton?
So you explained a little bit about you changed the, it's not the youth group. You used the new term envision. But could you explain more? What's the real difference between the youth group and your envision thing?
Yeah, so I'll pull up the slide. Yeah, so as Jeff often talks about, you can't use words that are tied to old paradigms because it conjures up images of the old paradigm. So Envision Life was a name that we had been using in our network for a while that people were familiar with, and also our middle schoolers already had binders with Envision Life on them. So that was a factor in our decision. The name is less important than it not being a traditional Western youth group. We're trying to create a real separation because if someone came to Envision Life thinking it was going to be a Western youth group like many other large churches here in town, they would be very disappointed. So we want to set expectations properly, that this is an establishing time, not just to come and play games, traditional Western youth group.
But what do you expect to happen in the future?
Yeah, what's the...
What is it, maybe contending for the faith or just getting people set up and then...
That was a leading question.
What's that?
Strike that question. That was a leading question, Your Honor.
That's a leading question.
What did they say?
They didn't quite get it from
No, he focused on
Renton.
the name. They didn't focus on the principles.
we can rescue them a little.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're trying to, Envision Life is also an intentional name choice because we're trying to orient our young people towards a lifetime of contending for the faith, capturing them in this phase of life where a lot of big decisions are made, that they're kind of figuring out who they are and where they're going to go.
The differences seem painfully obvious to the two of you, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not as painfully obvious to everybody else, I don't think. So that's where you got to keep explaining it over and over and over.
All right.
Okay, anybody else? Because I can see by their body language, they're like, why do we have to explain this? Didn't the slides explain this? And the answer is not quite.
I have a question that might be useful. Why is it important to have peer-to-peer leadership or like peer-to-peer communication? Why is that something you guys...
That's a good question. Repeat the question for us.
So why is it important to have peer-to-peer leadership? And communication and dialogue from peers to peers. You answer. I've already answered.
Yeah. So part of that was we learned it from our own experience because James and I sought out Jeff and Michael, and initially it was kind of a one-on-one thing, but then we brought together all our peers, and we recognized that the force that was moving us forward was more that the accountability the peers had within each other to call each other out and make sure things are happening the right way. So we wanted to have that same kind of process and feeling of a group where you're going to respect your peers in a different way than you respect someone older than you. So when they're saying something that actually means something, you actually pay attention than like some older teacher that you might not even want to listen to. So.
Yep, it's good. All right, thanks guys, good. And I'll tell you, these guys, yeah, we can clap for them. They really, I hope in your own setting, these guys really took ownership. They took ownership. That was probably the biggest thing. That was so, just like the rest of us, we're on a developmental pathway. All of us are in the conversion process. But but they really took ownership that said, hey, we can really develop our peers in our group to really take this paradigm seriously and get it embedded, envisioned into their lives. So just even that is such a huge step that you don't want Jeff and I to be dead before they start leading. They got to be on the job. Okay.
And also remember that sometimes Timothy was probably 18 when Paul got him, 19 when he's sending him with the Thessalonican letter down to help establish the church. So we have a tendency, if our churches are fairly well established, for the youth to become emerging adults and really not be entrusted, with ministry opportunities. So that's part of the picture of this too.
Yep. They gotta take ownership early, and you gotta entrust them with some things early. But there's the whole network and all the churches and the families are surrounding them. Jeff and I are not easy on them, as you can tell. I like to make fun of someone who wears shorts in the wintertime. But that's us. Okay. Open this booklet. Everybody got this booklet? If you don't have this booklet, it is possible to do in this booklet, but I'm going to be referencing this booklet.
I can't open it because you have mine again.
So what we're going to do is, did someone hear something? A little echo or something, maybe? A joke that we've heard before, maybe? Page 3 in this booklet, and it goes on, early letters, onto page 5 and 6, I think, is Romans. So 3 to page 6, why don't you envision either your whole church network, maybe, but for some, maybe that's too big of a bite. Thingren, maybe you want to take a smaller bite. Maybe you want to envision a singular church. Maybe you want to envision your leadership team. You can take a picture something that is real in your situation that you want to evaluate, that you want to assess back to this traditioning process. And then once you have that picture in your mind of who or what, the size of that, the field of that, go through and code it, slight problem, doing well, slight problem, or major problem. And if it's too much for you, you don't have to do, we just want to see you working with it and make some progress in it. So if you don't want to do all of the early letters 3 through 6, then try to do at least Galatians. At least do Galatians. But think through it in a very serious way. And then I might just walk around. Bill maybe can walk around a little bit too, or others, or Steve or James can walk around a little bit and maybe answer some questions if you've got some questions while you're doing it. But why don't you take 15 minutes to do that? And then we'll get back together, pass the microphone around, and share a little bit why you assessed what you assessed. Can we do that? Any questions? Anything you want to add to that, Jeff?
Which books are they? Did you give them?
What do you mean? Which books? Early letters. Early letters is
the whole early letters.
All the early letters. If you can do all the early letters, let's see. That's a good question. That's a fair question. I don't know how to answer that. Tom said, if there's 3 or 4 of you that all represent a church or a couple of churches, should you do it all together or should you do it individually? Maybe for now, just do it individually.
Yeah.
Do it individually because it's not so much that you get it right. It's more about just how you begin to think. These are topos-based questions, and so they're in a way they're teaching you what that literary section is talking about, the author's intended meaning of that section. So they're pretty jam-packed questions. So do it individually, I think, Tom. Any other questions? Isaac, what's that? Who needs one of these? We got one. We got just only one. Two. I need one, and Cruz needs one.
Hey, bring me one because I lost mine.
Yeah. Well, you know, maybe that dog that you were chasing, maybe he ate it. The dog ate it. The dog ate his homework, guys. All right, go to it. 15 minutes. We'll come back. Stirring. Joshua, you want to bring your book up here. I want to take pictures of it, and then I can show it on the screen. My phone. Oh, my phone. Okay. We got a couple. Good. Good. Yeah, we'll give you the microphone when you're done.
Looks like Nancy's.
Okay, so, let me do this later.
This is about as discombobulated
As,
and disorganized mess on here that I've seen you do.
yeah, when I have to share a table with you, that's what happens. Steve, did you text it to? Oh, no, you're texting it to me now. Okay. Samuel, you going to run the microphone around? Somebody give us your feedback on how that went for you. Did you, George? You've done this multiple times. I'm going to pick on you. I don't want to waste 2 minutes of time waiting for somebody to jump out of their chair. So, George, tell us, you've done this a couple different times. What's different this time than some other times that you've gone?
I think as I'm reading, I'm able to better absorb and apply to my situation than earlier. And I can see that as time has progressed and as we've been applying the principles, we can see that the scale is getting better. It feels like
What's getting better?
The scale, I mean, the situation
scale.
is improving.
Oh, okay. You mean your church situation?
Yes.
How about your ability to assess?
Definitely better.
If you want to listen to people, don't multitask. What I'm doing right now is multitasking. That's terrible listening. Go ahead.
As I said before, that as we go through this, it feels like there's a kind of a diagnosis that is taking place, some kind of an MRI kind of a feeling that you're going through, and then suddenly you get this result that kind of puts an overall picture of your situation or your condition of your churches and networks. Mm-hmm. Kind of an enterprise diagnostic tool.
Mm-hmm. What has it done to your confidence of that MRI tool? Because you did it.
I didn't have anything before.
You didn't have any confidence before?
No. Yeah, I didn't have any tool, or I did not have an understanding of assessment the way that this is being done before this tool had first come to me.
When were you first introduced to that tool?
When I started the MEXI after the MacDemon.
Okay. So a year and a half ago.
Yeah, a year ago, yeah.
And did you do an assessment then?
Yes, I did, but it was overwhelming that time.
It was?
Overwhelming that time.
Overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Felt like somebody was taking off your clothes.
Okay, that's an image. Ooh. I thought Jeff and I were a little bit on the edge. That's on the edge. Or as Isaac would say, out of pocket. Good. Thank you, George. Let's go to, I forget your name, not Fiznik. Joria? Floria. Floria. All right, Floria. Well, this is dangerous. You're going to see all of my text messages. But that's just going to be the way it is.
Okay,
so this is your...
Okay, I haven't completed as it looks like entirely, but I reached out until the Corinthian letters.
Okay, so you got to Galatians and you went down to Corinthians, okay?
Yeah. But first a background. Yeah, I'm for the moment serving with church planting, and we have a house church. I'm part of the Sodal team for my city, which is close to Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. And yeah, when I got there, I saw there were some issues already. And on the first question that I saw here, I saw that we still have a slight problem. There are some believers that need to be established more in the kerygma. So if we want to go towards the idea of being a charismatic community, like there are many leaders, believers who need to be established more in the kerygma. Since I've seen still, the old paradigm preaching of the gospel. I sometimes hear it, even though we've gone through the first principles series, but I still hear that kind of preaching. And but people are seeing the fruits of the kerygma according, the real biblical kerygma when they are on the terrain, when they speak to their neighbors, when they speak to their loved ones. It totally makes sense compared to the old Western paradigm kind of gospel formula. So this is there is a slight problem, but I'm very positive about it. We're getting there. So
okay.
The next one, are there any signs of deserting the gospel in our churches, more specifically embracing another gospel that distorts the gospel, making it a different gospel or altered gospel from the one delivered to them by Paul? So far, I haven't noticed anything like that. Okay. So we are good at this point. The next one is, in our churches or networks, are there any who are true believers but adding rules and regulations to the gospel, thus causing our churches to embrace a gospel that is not pure, as delivered by Paul, which he received from the apostles? So there's a slight problem in this part. We had a former leader who's trying to make more meetings according to the old paradigm, fragmentations in ministry. And I don't blame him, because it's not that he knew much about the paradigm of, the way of Christ and the apostles. But the positive thing is that those things have stopped, but it has caused a bit of damage in people's mindsets. So people expect us to have like meetings, Sunday services, and I said no. So
it damages their mindsets.
The damage is still there. It's not like in those big established churches that the damage is much deeper and have taken deeper roots. But still, there is slight problem. There is slight damage caused by that. And the next one is, our churches...
You're very thorough. This is good. This may take till 5:30, but this is good.
Well, in what you just said illustrates the fact that you're not only do you have to accurately understand the question, but there is a level of art to, is it a slight problem? What does a slight problem look like? Which is why we've got the margin. However, I will say, in the midst of those compliments, that I was telling Michael, that looks like a mess, Michael, but now I realize it's your mess. It's not Michael's mess in the booklet.
This is Joshua's mess.
Yeah. Doesn't that look like a mess?
Gloria's mess. I think it looks like real church. It looks like real life.
I think maybe he was a doctor before he...
Like what?
A doctor.
Oh, yeah.
Doctors, right.
Keep going, Floria.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep going. You're good.
Are our churches becoming solidly established in the new way of living according to a new set of principles? So, yeah. I'm not going to read the entire, so I don't take the time. In the house church in our town, we are moving fastly towards that freedom. So, of course, we are trying to remove anything canonic that the Western paradigm has, and that is connected to the Old Testament kind of law, towards the new canon of faith, or which is laid out in Paul's teaching. So, and it's overall going very well for the moment.
You don't have to read the question. Go ahead and just give us your comments, Floria.
So many people still don't understand this in the next one.
Yeah, what is this?
Walking in the Spirit.
In the Spirit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
thinking and walking in the Spirit. We still have that old mindset of, okay, the Spirit works instantly, and you can have mystic experiences and brings that mystic experiences. So, yeah, we still don't have that entirely that new mindset that the Spirit is a spirit of strategy that, yeah, moves the church.
Yep.
So we still have some, there is a slight problem, and we are starting to understand it, and
Good.
yeah.
That's such a, yeah, people can always get into their denominational camps about how the Spirit works, and can you create an environment where the Spirit can flourish?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Spirit's always there. Can't say that.
Yeah.
But yep, okay.
So, do our churches respect authorities initially appointed by apostolic leaders? For the moment, yes.
Okay.
So it's a good point.
Okay, and then you got about 5 here.
Yeah. Initial genuine conversion. There are some occasions of people who don't fully embrace the gospel and the new way of life. There are some, it's a slight problem, but we've noticed that all of those who had the zeal to attend every of our first principle teaching meeting, let's say, they started to understand more quickly about the new way of life and embrace the gospel. And one thing that I noticed that was the first thing that they understand is the kerygma. That's the first thing that goes to their mind, you know. And yeah, next one.
Well, let's do this. I think we've gotten a sense. Are you in FEMI's?
Yes.
Network? Okay. Near Pristina?
Near Pristina, yeah.
In Kosovo. Any questions for Floria? Floria? Any comments or questions for him?
Actually, I've got a question for him.
Yeah.
What you did is a fairly sophisticated set of assessments, you know, as you're going through each one. What did you find in the process that allowed you to do that? That's not quite the question I want, but.
What? Yeah, say it again. I don't think I.
Well, it's like that's fairly sophisticated analysis, you know, as you're going through this.
Okay.
Why were you able to do that? This is your first time through, right?
My first time, yes.
Yeah. So why were you able to do this? This question is not really a setup question because you could do 2 or 3 things with it, but people are afraid. One of the reasons why people are slow to accept apostolic leadership or authority is they don't want to move into that kind of level of responsibility when they were just pastors before, you know, and what if I'm not that, so on. But you're doing pretty high evaluation here, first time through. Why were you able to do that? How did the tool help empower you to do that?
Well, as I went through the questions here, as I went through the, you know, all of these, I was able to understand more things that I didn't see before. Like, I believe even others that did this assessment had similar experience at least. But if I didn't read all of these assessment questions, let's call it, I wouldn't be able to identify some of the issues, some of the problems. Yeah. I know there are some problems, but sometimes we need something like a guide that at the same time it challenges us, like questions. So I think that was one of the reasons.
Yeah, and that's what I thought, because see, as you move through this, it's the difference between a topic question and a topos-based topic statement, something like that. Because what this is, what you're evaluating, because you're dealing with an idea of Paul that's pretty sophisticated but clear, you know, and that's why we work so hard on the clarity of these, that they match the sessions in it, because you're actually able to think like Paul, because that's just not a question. It's just not a topic. That is a Pauline topos statement. And so even if you haven't done your own work, you'll be a lot better when you've done your own work too, but still, your own work is going to be held up against the sharpness of these statements. And so you'll have more to draw on, but still the statements, you know, they're very powerful because they really do reflect the collection of the ideas progressively through. And so you can do sophisticated analysis because of that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You had something back there? Yeah, the handing out the books guy.
That's really good to see. Very good.
Okay, so I want to ask something, as you said, it took my attention. As you said that a spirit is a spirit of strategy, okay? So are you minimizing the fact that the spirit is a spirit of power? Without that, we cannot be a witness. So I just want to ask, what is your understanding of it?
I didn't understand. Do you understand that?
What do you think first? Before you put that question on him, why don't you answer your own question?
As the Bible says, you cannot be a witness of gospel with power without the power of the Holy Spirit. So this is my understanding. So if we are limiting only the power of the Holy Spirit for the strategies he gives to us, so I think we are minimizing the whole person of Holy Spirit.
What's the issue?
He's suggesting that by saying the Spirit is strategic, we're minimizing the Spirit's power.
Well, maybe I can give an answer, okay? Yeah, actually, maybe that was more like a misunderstanding. I believe that the Spirit that is building the church, that's the most miraculous thing that God can do. And signs and miracles, the power of the Spirit, personal, let's say, personal experience with the Holy Spirit is the least what God can do. So it's my opinion, so that's why I'm thinking. What I think, I never limit the Spirit, yeah. But the issue with many churches is that they are stuck only in that part of signs and miracles, and they cannot see the vision for the church. That's the issue. So that's why I said that Spirit is a spirit of strategy, and because, it gives us a strategy. It's giving us the strategy for building the church. Thank you.
Yeah. We could flip a coin on it, but the reality, the question you asked tells me that you don't understand what it means for the Spirit to work. Yours is magical.
Yours is mystical. And it's in your book, too, that you keep handing around to everybody.
So you need to study the Galatians one.
You need to tie yourself to Paul's traditioning process. Because it's too elementary. You're elementary in your understanding of how the Spirit works.
He'll probably never ask another question.
Well, that's the problem, though, is you have to be, you have to get past that the Spirit's just going to magically be powerful and magically work, and we don't have a role in it.
See, it goes up, the observation goes all the way back to Acts 1, where they're waiting for the power to come. But part of the power, the heart of that is that the Spirit's going to bring you the teaching you didn't have. The Spirit's going to bring you the strategy.
Jesus wanted to bring that, but he said, wait.
So
Wait.
he is a strategic spirit. And then when you walk in the Spirit, you walk in this, it's not magical, you walk in the sphere of that teaching that's delivered by the apostles that is through the Spirit was given to them through the Apostle Paul. So you're walking in that way, and that means you're walking in the Spirit. It's not like you're filled with the Spirit and zapped with power and now you can do it. That's what we mean by magical. So in global Pentecostal, in a lot of Pentecostal traditions, people are taught to think that way. It's very hard to get out of it.
It's a tough tradition to get out, because what happened after Acts 2? How did the Spirit work after Acts 2? Acts 2, we got power. What's Acts 3? More power. No, a multiplication of churches. And that's where the Spirit is moving and building His kingdom, is His building of His church. So you got to get past the milk understanding of just saying the Spirit's powerful, and for you to say the Spirit is strategic, is we're now at odds. I don't agree with you. What do you mean by that? Because that just creates a distortion that's unnecessary, and because you're not dealing with the depth of how the Spirit works, of how we're instructed to be in the mind of the Spirit. Okay, Joshua, let's show yours.
Who? Oh, Joshua.
Joshua. Oh, wait a minute here.
What are you going to do, Joshua? Give a sermon?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and get started without me showing it. Highlight it for us, Joshua.
Is that?
Don't read us every word, but give us a.
Yeah.
Go ahead and get started. We'll bump you back to the middle of the road if you get in the ditch.
Okay, I will highlight a few.
What's he doing?
I don't know what he's doing.
Whose is this?
Which part should I go on?
So how many times have you done this, Joshua? This book? Or how many times have you assessed? This obviously, you didn't do all this in 15 minutes, did you?
Yeah, sure. We made an assessment since last week with Steve, so
this is your second time?
Yeah, this is my second time.
What did you learn this time?
First and foremost, the tool gives us a critical analysis and thinking through as we interact with different checks and different issues as highlighted, whether you're doing well, whether there's a slight problem or a major problem or issue arising from the issues as highlighted by Paul's comprehensive analysis. So with the Galatians church.
With the Galatians one?
Yeah.
I didn't take a picture of the Galatians one. But
you didn't take a picture? Or I begin?
Can you do something out of... I don't know how to lead you well in this. You've got so much here, which is great, but I don't know how we can all...
I can just highlight a
few.
few.
What are the most major problems that you think you have?
The major problems, one, with the Corinthian letters, that is page 4.
Okay, in the Corinthian letters?
Yeah, page 4.
Page 4? Okay.
I read the question.
Yep, I see it now.
Okay, that one there.
The first, second, or third one?
The first one.
First one?
Yeah. Or we can go to the second one.
Okay, the second one.
Yeah. Is there a clear process in place for challenging the churches to build on the one foundation laid by Paul, taking care to realize that as networks grow globally, they will increase which will be a constant need.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what'd you write to the side here, and why did you say that's a major problem in your?
Yeah, there is a major problem because as our church networks grow bigger and expand, there comes a need of building systems and processes in place to, one, adopt to the increase in numbers, the expansion of the church network activities, and then we address the differences in the teachings and doctrine. So it is a major problem if we are to address the issues of expansion, especially of the church families or the church networks and the church systems put in place. And then when we move to the second one.
Okay. The third one, you mean?
Or the third one, yeah?
Yep. Okay.
Differences emerging in our churches and church networks relating to incomplete understanding of the gospel, which need addressing, as in the Corinthian churches, such as divisions in marriage, divisions over social status, lifestyle, divisions over men's and women's role. I think that is a major problem globally, around the world. Every person has a different perception and understanding of how things ought to be done. For example, things that can be eaten, things are not supposed to be eaten, what women are supposed to put on while entering church or not.
Yep.
So most networks or churches have institutionalized a lot of things that have become qualifications of who's supposed to come to church or who is qualified to enter church or maybe to become a Christian, and leaving out the apostolic intent of the word of Christ and his apostles, that there was no qualification. For example, there was no, how can I term it? Who qualifies to become part of the way? Or who qualifies to become an apostle? Who qualifies to follow the way of Christ? So there was no institutionalizing of things as it is, for example, in the Western way of thinking, and the seminary way of interpreting Christ's way and the apostles' way. So, to my thinking, it is a major problem. When we are addressing issues of divisionism in the church today and in the church society or community, it leaves out a lot of questions for who's supposed to be part of the way, and which lifestyle are we supposed to conduct ourselves while in church and probably outside church community. So it is a very big problem and a major issue to address. But as we interact through the scholars and the tools, Paul gives you an angle of competence that you must critically analyze the issues before you address it maybe to the church community or network of churches. So he gives a clear distinction and he puts it clear for us to address.
Let me make a comment at this time on, so I don't lose the idea. One of the things that is common here and that you're kind of saying between the lines is that how do you exercise apostolic authority in solving some of these problems if the people don't recognize your apostolic authority? You know, in other words, do they have to get to understand the whole idea of apostolic authority before you can exercise apostolic authority? What Paul did, Paul was in a situation where people were questioning that he had apostolic authority. And so how did he win in that situation? His arguments were more powerful. So the point is, even if you're trying to exercise apostolic authority and people won't let you, then you do it anyway in the conflict with more powerful arguments.
Because your authority, remember, and this gets back to your comment about the Spirit. What's your name back there? Brian, what's your name? Joshua. Joshua, and even back to yours with the Spirit, your authority comes from your alignment to the kerygma and the didache. It's not because you have a title. It's not because you self-appointed yourself. But what Paul is saying is the authority is the gospel itself. And the more you're lined up with the gospel and its tradition, you have authority. Now, whether people accept that authority or not is a different thing. But you have authority to give people the way.
Sure.
And so even let me tie in. I see in here it has speaking in tongues. Let's go back to you, Joshua, for a second of the Spirit. A lot of times people will, they'll put gifts, certain gifts of the Spirit higher than other gifts, and yet, and that's a bit of what you were doing in challenging strategic spirit, saying the power of the Spirit is better, and yet. And so speaking in tongues, for example, Paul takes that on very directly in 1 Corinthians 14 in the gathering. He said the whole gathering is for edification of everyone. And he would rather speak one word in his mind that edifies someone else than, what does he say, 100 or 1,000 tongues. So you have to rectify that with what you were saying, and that's why we're challenging you around that, because Paul takes that directly on. Because then again, we've said it, you get into this mystical thing, and yet Paul actually directly talked about that. So your authority, it doesn't mean people are going to always listen to the challenges, but that's how we get people into the way, is through, Hebrews author says, provoke one another.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to get to do is to start exercising apostolic authority, and when people don't recognize you as an apostolic leader. I mean, think about that. And remember when Paul said to Timothy, "Don't let anyone look down on your youthfulness." Well, Timothy needed to be respectful, but what Paul was doing is he was saying to Timothy, you got to do in the churches what I'm doing because I'm on my way out. And, you got to hold the sound doctrine, but you got to be shepherding. I mean, you got to be pounding away at them. All right? And so don't be timid, in there. But timid is you have to exercise apostolic authority even if you're younger, be respectful, but even if you're younger and it's not recognized as that, just shut up. No. He said to Timothy, don't let anybody shut you up, is what he's really saying in that context.
Yep. But again, you can't repeat it enough. Luke, you were saying it earlier, it integrates into what you were saying, is that you've got to master and be on a mastery pathway of Paul's schema, of Christ's mind. That's where the authority comes from. It doesn't come because you wrote a book. It doesn't come because you have a title that says you're a leader, whatever title you want to give yourself, or it doesn't come from having a degree. It comes from lining ourselves up with what the instructions Christ left us, the schema.
Sure. And maybe what helped Paul to achieve that was his character, because as he followed Christ, passing on this to faithful men, people like Timothy and Titus, he spoke through a character angle of life. And as he was passing it on to them, I think that was one of the tools that helped him so much to be able to capture the mindset of the apostles. As he followed Christ, the way of Christ, his disciples were following Paul, a follower of Christ. Yeah. So character was part of his greatest scores in that angle. Yeah.
But the key thing is that Paul, when Paul talks about these powerful arguments of his, what Paul's really doing is he's saying, I'm standing in this authoritative tradition, this teaching of Christ, and I know what I'm talking about. I mean, you got to have your arguments. And so Paul is arguing these issues and solving the problems and even expressing his opinion all the way through the Corinthian situation. It's really hard to get that idea because we think people have to accept it before we exercise it. You know, it's kind of a trap. And so pastors are afraid to begin. Well, and you got another question too, and that is, do the gifts ever develop? That's another question. In other words, if you're doing this and your capacity for understanding these things and the Spirit giving you more insight, is your actual capacity, is the gift actually developing in the context of it? And I think I can make a case for that kind of development.
All right.
This is good assessment. Both of these are very good assessments.
Yeah, thanks for putting it out there, Floria. Thanks for putting it out there, Joshua. Thanks for the question, Joshua, in the back. I know we challenge you around it, but that's where learning happens. That's where growth and learning happens. Tomorrow, we will do session 5. Encourage you to read session 5 tonight, and session 6 and 7 we'll do tomorrow afternoon. So session 5 and session 6 and 7 will be for tomorrow. I'm going to pray for us. So don't leave quite yet. Let me pray for us. Let me pray for us. Lord, we've once again, would you continue to stir amongst us? We thank you for the progress of all of our growth and conversion in you. And Lord, you've given us all a mighty, mighty task to take to the ends of the earth, into our fields, your first tradition. And so, Lord, we continue to know that, Lord, we need each other. We need these ongoing conversations. But would you sustain us? And would you sustain us in our churches? Would you sustain us by our conversations? Would you sustain us with your Spirit? Lord, as we take on the world and take on the paradigms, Lord, it is a battle. And so give us clarity of mind, give us strength of argument, give us a peace that passes all understanding. Lord, as we finish up 5 and 6 and 7 tomorrow, would you give us continued understanding, continued comprehension with all the saints that have gone before us, to know the breadth and the length and the height and the depth of your love for the church, your love for us. As leaders, we have a mighty, mighty task, and so would you find us faithful to the task that you've put before us. In your name we pray, amen. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow morning.